Hello, my name is Mary Whitmore, and I'm bringing women's history to you today. We're celebrating August 26, 1920, Women's Equality Day. This speech, entitled "We Can Do It," is from the National Women's History Project. On August 26th, we are celebrating the anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. With that amendment, 51% of the United States population that had only had limited say in their government, the women, won the right to vote. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 capped the most extensive civil rights campaign our nation has ever experienced. The amazing story of that grassroots campaign is a proud part of our shared history that is fascinating, full of brilliance, daring, and heroism. Women gave the accumulated possibilities of entire lifetimes to win the vote. Their story merits remembering and retelling often. It's a story that can bolster us as we promote women's advancements during our own lives as well. To recognize this important constitutional anniversary and as a reminder of women's continuing efforts for equality, August 26th is formally designated Women's Equality Day. The idea originated with a massive parade down Fifth Avenue in New York City to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the amendment's passage. The following year, in 1971, Bella Abzug was a new member of Congress when she introduced a resolution to proclaim August 26th as Women's Equality Day. It passed in the House and Senate and has been affirmed by the President every year since. How many of us are already familiar with details of women's suffrage movement in this country? Not many, I'm afraid. It is a very dramatic story, one that opens in the earliest days of the American Republic, when the basic concepts for the new government were being hotly debated. It's a story of women's perseverance and determination against strenuous opposition. It illustrates how a fundamental belief that the rights of citizenship should belong to all Americans resulted from a gradual change of minds and attitudes. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution sounds simple and reasonable to us today. It reads, "The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." But it had been on account of sex that the women had been denied that most basic right of democracy for the first 144 years of our nation's history. From colonial times to the present, women have put their minds to winning expanded rights and freedoms through the government. At the outset, in 1776, Abigail Adams sent this urgent advice to her husband John, who was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. "In the new Code of Laws," she wrote, "I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws to which we have no voice or representation." John Adams' reply voiced his own opinion about women's rights and reflected the sentiment of that exclusively male meeting. Quote, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems." End quote. The rebellion Abigail Adams threatened to foment at the birth of the Republic did not take place in her lifetime. Still, she did help sow the seeds of anti-slavery work and advocated greater educational opportunity for women. Those two reform movements would lead directly to the creation of a full-blown women's rights movement 70 years later. In 1840, Lucretia Mott, a Quaker minister, had become so important in the anti-slavery movement that she was one of 6 women elected for the American delegation to the World Anti-Slavery Convention to be held in London. Imagine the amazement when the delegation arrived there and the women delegates were refused seats on the floor. Unbelievably, they were told they could only observe the proceedings seated in the balcony behind a screen. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was at this convention too. She and Lucretia Mott were appalled by the attitude the abolitionist men demonstrated toward women, and pledged that one day they would do something about securing equal rights for all women. 8 years later, Lucretia Mott visited Elizabeth Stanton at her home in upstate New York. Over tea, they reminisced about their earlier experience together in London. Right then, they and 3 of their friends daringly agreed to call for a women's rights convention. They placed a small ad in a local newspaper with no idea what kind of response it would get. They were astounded when wagon loads of women and men poured into Seneca Falls for that landmark meeting. On July 19, 1848, over 300 people, most of them women, discussed and adopted a revolutionary Declaration of Sentiments. The document was based on the new nation's revered Declaration of Independence. In it were listed the many abuses women suffered under the legal and political systems then in force, including the following: no voice in the laws, no independent rights after marriage, no custody of children in case of divorce, no right to a college education, no opportunity to enter most professions, no right to vote. The nearly 100 people who signed this bold Declaration of Sentiments knew at the time they would face misrepresentation and ridicule. As they entered upon what they called the great work before us, they made this pledge: we will use every instrumentality within our power to effect our object. We shall employ agents, circulate tracts, petition the state and national legislatures, and endeavor to enlist the pulpit and press in our behalf. In the decades to come, they did just that. Although the people signing the Declaration had anticipated opposition, few of them were prepared for the level of vilification that came from both the press and the pulpit. Newspaper editors ran hateful articles about how women just wanted to be men, how progressive women were terrible mothers, how these new ideas of equality for women would destroy the very fabric of society. The clergy denounced the early women's rights activists with a particular vehemence, decrying these signers as aberrant, ungodly, obviously in cahoots with the devil. These attacks were vicious and unrelenting. Yet these articles and sermons, no matter how negative, had one definitely positive effect. They spread the discussion far, far beyond that original meeting. Of all the issues the convention had originally raised, the aftermath of the Civil War crystallized the need for reformers to focus first and foremost on women's right to vote. At the end of the war, slavery was abolished. Progressive people hoped that an amendment for universal suffrage, the vote for all, would be the next step in expanding American democracy. But instead, the 14th Amendment drove a wedge between the activists for the abolition of slavery and for women's rights. It added language to the Constitution implying that the right to vote was the exclusive right of men. And worse was to come. When the 15th Amendment was proposed soon after, it stated that while the right to vote could not be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, the vote still could and definitely would be denied on the basis of sex. Many equal rights advocates were aghast at this proposal. Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were leaders in both the abolitionist and women's rights movements, refused to support the limitations of this 15th Amendment. In 1869, two national organizations were established, both dedicated to advancing women's rights. The National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was more expansive in its reach. It sought an amendment to the federal Constitution that would give all women the right to vote no matter where they lived. They also pressed for reforms on a variety of rights issues that included clothing restrictions, marriage laws, women's property rights, employment opportunities, and education. The other organization, the American Women's Suffrage Association, was founded by Julia Ward Howe and Lucy Stone. They focused their efforts entirely on winning the vote at the state level. When the two organizations finally merged 20 years later, very little progress had actually been made. Some Western territories had granted women the right to vote, hoping to increase their sparse populations by attracting more women as settlers. In 1889, when the Wyoming Territory applied for statehood, Congress insisted that they discontinue female voting rights in order to join the Union. Wyoming refused, saying this, quote, "We will remain out of the Union 100 years rather than come in without women's suffrage," end quote. Congress relented, and Wyoming became the first state where women could participate fully in all levels of their government. Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a brilliant strategist and organizer, took over leadership and directed the campaign for the next 5 years. New organizations were also formed that galvanized labor and media support through their innovative tactics. For instance, by staging parades that drew thousands of marchers and tens of thousands of spectators, the suffragists began to call worldwide attention to President Wilson's hypocrisy. Alice Paul simultaneously stepped up pressure directly on Congress for passage of the federal amendment. She helped organize the National Women's Party to channel the votes of women in suffrage states, to elect legislators who favored such an amendment. She also initiated an entirely new tactic that proved to be extremely powerful in changing public sentiment: picketing the White House. For over a year, Alice Paul coordinated an ongoing demonstration beside the White House gate. Thousands of women from across the country took turns standing there quietly, even in the most foul winter weather. They held up banners that said, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" This is part 1 of the speech. Please tune in to Women's Equality Day, August 26, 1920, part 2 by Mary. And I dedicate this speech to my grandchildren, and I wish every woman as much power as possible to go forward in this world to help girls and women gain equality in every aspect of society. Thank you.